The message came without warning. It arrived on every human communication channel at the same time. Radio, digital, quantum relay, and even the old satellite networks that nobody really used anymore. A single line of text, translated perfectly into every human language, appeared on every screen across Earth and its colonies. The Galactic Council formally requests the presence of 3 human representatives at Nexus Station within 30 planetary rotations. Refusal is not advised. Most species who received a summons like that trembled. Governments collapsed. Populations rioted. When the Galactic Council called, you came, and you came afraid. Earth read the message, shrugged collectively, and started arguing about who to send. The United Earth Assembly spent 3 days debating. Diplomats nominated themselves. Military generals pushed their own candidates. Scientists volunteered eagerly. It was a mess, loud and chaotic, and very human. Eventually, they settled on 3 names, not because of unanimous agreement, but because those 3 kept getting mentioned, no matter who was doing the talking. John Morrison was the first name. He was 53 years old, heavyset, with gray hair that he never bothered to comb properly. He had spent 30 years working as a senior negotiator for the Assembly's External Relations Division. He had settled border disputes between Mars colonies, negotiated mining rights in the asteroid belt, and once talked a crew of 47 stranded workers down from a full-scale mutiny on a deep space platform. He was not charming. He was not impressive to look at. But he had a gift that was almost impossible to describe. He could find the exact thing that the other side was afraid of, and then make them feel like he understood it completely. He wasn't manipulative. He just listened better than anyone else alive. Captain Chen was the second name. She commanded the EFS Relentless, a heavy escort vessel that had seen combat in 3 separate colonial conflicts. She was 41, lean and sharp-featured, with the kind of calm that made junior officers nervous because they could never tell what she was thinking. She had a reputation across the fleet, not for aggression, but for precision. She never fired first. She never wasted a shot. She had once held a blockade position for 19 days against a force 4 times her size, not by fighting them, but by making it absolutely clear that fighting her would cost them more than the objective was worth. The fleet called her the Anchor. She considered it a compliment. Captain Marcus was the 3rd. He was the youngest of the 3, at 38, tall, broad-shouldered, and visibly relaxed in situations that made everyone around him sweat. He commanded the EFS Ironhold, a newer vessel, fast and heavily armed. Where Chen was precision, Marcus was instinct. He had a habit of making decisions in the middle of situations that, on paper, had no good options, and somehow coming out the other side with fewer casualties than the mission planners had projected as acceptable losses. He smiled a lot. He laughed at things that weren't funny. Other captains found him slightly unsettling because he seemed genuinely comfortable with danger, not reckless, just unbothered. The 3 of them met for the first time in person on the shuttle to Nexus Station. Morrison had read their files. Chen had read Morrison's file and ignored Marcus's. Marcus had read nobody's file and brought a thermos of coffee that smelled strong enough to clear a corridor. "So," Marcus said, settling into his seat with the ease of someone on a vacation transport, "does anyone actually know what they want from us?" "The Council has not disclosed a specific agenda," Morrison said. "Right. Classic power move." Marcus poured coffee into the thermos cap and offered it to Chen, who declined without looking at him. "Whatever they want," Chen said. "We should assume it is not in our favor." "Everything starts as not in our favor," Morrison said mildly. "That's why they send negotiators." The journey to Nexus Station took 11 days. The station itself was enormous, a structure roughly the size of a small moon, orbiting a neutral star system, equidistant from the territories of 7 major galactic civilizations. It had existed for over 4,000 years. It had hosted the resolution of wars, the signing of treaties, the formal dissolution of entire species from active galactic status. It was, in every sense, a place where the powerful gathered to decide the fates of the less powerful. The docking bay alone was larger than most Earth cities. Ships of 17 different designs sat in their berths, some organic-looking, grown rather than built, others geometric and cold, mathematical in their precision. A few were actively terrifying to look at, designed by minds that did not share human ideas. About comfort or aesthetics, Morrison looked at all of it calmly and made mental notes. Chen assessed exit vectors and defensive positions out of habit. Marcus finished his coffee. They were met at the docking ramp by an ethon, a species that resembled tall, silver-skinned beings with 4 upper limbs and eyes that shifted color with their emotional state. The ethon were the Council's primary administrative species, efficient and formal, deeply committed to procedure. "You are the human delegates," the ethon said. Its eyes were a pale yellow, which the briefing document said indicated professional neutrality. "We are," Morrison confirmed. "The Council will hear your species in 3 rotations. You will be housed in the diplomatic quarter. You will not access restricted areas. You will not engage in private negotiations with any Council member species without prior disclosure. Violations carry formal sanction." "Understood," Morrison said pleasantly. The ethon paused. Its eyes flickered briefly to a darker shade. "You are not distressed, should we be?" Morrison asked. The ethon did not answer, but its eyes shifted again, cycling through colors before settling back to yellow. It turned and led them through the corridor without another word. Later, in their assigned quarters, which were comfortable by alien diplomatic standards and would have been considered a mid-range hotel by human ones, Chen sat across from Morrison with her arms folded. "It expected us to be scared," she said. "Yes," Morrison agreed. "Why does that matter?" "Because it changes how they've prepared for this conversation," Morrison said. "Everything they have planned assumes we came here afraid. They've arranged this to maximize our discomfort and their authority. The whole structure of the meeting, the waiting period, the formal restrictions. The size of this station, it's designed to make smaller species feel small. And we don't," Marcus said from where he was lying on the room's strange, curved couch with his eyes closed. "We don't," Morrison confirmed. "Is that good or bad?" Chen asked. Morrison considered. "It's information. What they do when their script stops working tells us a great deal about what they actually want." Outside, through the reinforced viewport, the station's central hub rotated slowly, and hundreds of ships from dozens of species moved in its shadow. Every one of them, in their way, was here because the Council had called them. Every one of them had come afraid. 3 humans sat in a mid-range diplomatic suite, drank terrible alien coffee, and waited. Somewhere in the Council chamber, 17 representatives of the galaxies. Most powerful civilizations were preparing to tell humanity its place. They had not yet considered the possibility that humanity might disagree. 3 rotations passed slowly. Morrison spent the time reviewing every publicly available Council ruling from the past 2 centuries. Chen ran quiet tactical assessments of the station's layout, which she did not share with anyone but filed neatly in her mind. Marcus explored the diplomatic quarter, struck up conversations with delegates from 6 other species, learned 3 new card games, and returned each evening with information that neither Morrison nor Chen had thought to look for. On the morning of the 3rd rotation, the summons came. Not a request, not an invitation. A directive delivered in the flat, certain language of entities who had issued directives for 4,000 years without being refused. The 3 humans dressed, straightened up, and walked toward the Council chamber. Morrison did not rehearse his arguments. Chen did not check her footing. Marcus did not stop smiling. They walked the way humans walked when they had decided something not aggressive, not loud, just completely and quietly certain that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The chamber doors, 12 meters tall and carved from material older than Earth's first cities, opened in front of them. Inside, 17 of the most powerful beings in the galaxy looked down at 3 humans, and none of them, in all their centuries of experience, had thought to prepare for what came next. The council chamber was built to intimidate, and it was very good at its job. The room was circular, roughly 400 meters across, with a ceiling so high it was lost in engineered shadow. The floor was polished black stone, threaded with bioluminescent veins that pulsed faintly, like a slow heartbeat. The 17 council seats were arranged in a raised arc, each one elevated progressively higher than the last, so that whoever stood at the center of the floor, the designated speaking position, was always looking up, always below, always small. Every deliberate detail had been refined over 40 centuries of careful design. Species who stood in the center had wept, had prostrated themselves, had delivered their arguments in shaking voices and signed whatever they were given. Just to make the experience stop, Morrison walked to the center of the floor, looked up at 17 alien faces, and clasped his hands behind his back the way he did in every difficult meeting. Chen stood 2 steps to his left, hands loose at her sides, eyes moving across the chamber in the quiet. Habitual survey of someone cataloging a space. Marcus stood to Morrison's right, looking mildly interested. The way a person looks when they've arrived at a restaurant they've heard good things about. The lead counselor spoke first. It was a Vreth, an ancient species, insectoid in structure, with a body that suggested both fragility and enormous hidden strength. Its translator rendered its voice into flat, precise human speech. Humanity, it said, making the word sound like a category rather than a name. You have been called before this council because your species has become a matter of concern. Morrison nodded slightly, the way he nodded when a negotiation was going exactly where he expected. Your expansion rate over the last 40 years exceeds council-approved growth parameters by a factor of 3. Your military capacity has increased without formal declaration to the registry. You have made unilateral first contact with 4 species without council coordination. And your colonization of the Reach territories was conducted without territorial review. It paused. The silence in the chamber was the kind that was meant to fill with apology. Morrison let it sit. He let it sit until it became slightly unusual that he hadn't spoken. Then he said, calmly and without edge, "We weren't aware that our growth required approval." The chamber shifted in the way that chambers shift when something unexpected happens, not loudly, but in small physical ways. The rustling of limbs, the change in atmospheric humidity from several different species simultaneously recalibrating their composure, all species operating within council space are subject to council development parameters, the Vreth said. We were never formally admitted to council jurisdiction, Morrison said. Our first contact with council representatives occurred 19 years ago. At that time, we received a document outlining council existence and general governance. We were not presented with a membership agreement, a territorial framework, or a development code. We were given information. We acknowledged receiving it. He paused. Acknowledging that something exists is not the same as agreeing to be governed by it. The second counselor, a Marin, fluid and tall, its body translucent enough to see its internal structures shifting, leaned forward. You are in council space. That jurisdiction is not contingent on your agreement. Then we have different definitions of jurisdiction, Morrison said pleasantly, which is exactly the kind of disagreement that benefits from a proper conversation rather than a directive. That's why we came. Chen watched the council members. Not their words, their physical responses. She had spent years reading opponents under pressure, and aliens she had discovered in the 3 days aboard this station were not as unreadable as humans assumed. The tells were different, but they were there. The Vreth had shifted weight twice during Morrison's first response. The Marin's internal structures were moving faster. A third counselor, species she hadn't identified yet, had stopped moving entirely, which in her experience meant either supreme calm or acute discomfort. And given the context, she was betting on the latter. She kept all of it to herself. Watching, Marcus, meanwhile, was watching the chamber exits, the seating arrangements, and the body language of the non-council attendees, the aides and administrators and observers arranged in the upper tiers. He noticed that several of them had gone very still in a way that looked like they were trying not to react. He noted which species they represented and filed it away. The Vreth resumed control of the session. Humanity's military expansion is the primary concern. Your fleet capacity now rivals that of several council member species. This presents a destabilizing variable. We built ships because we needed ships, Chen said. Her voice carried the same weight it used on the bridge. Not loud, but the kind of tone that made rooms pay attention. We have 47 active colonies and resource operations distributed across 11 star systems. Protecting those installations and the transit lanes between them is not aggression. It's basic logistics. The Council determines what constitutes appropriate logistical capacity, the Vreth said. With respect, Jones said, in a tone that conveyed no particular respect. The Council has not been protecting our installations. We have. So the Council's judgment about what capacity we need is working from incomplete information about our actual situation. There was a longer silence. Morrison noticed that the Vreth's compound eyes had adjusted their focus, a small thing. But it suggested the question had landed somewhere uncomfortable. A fourth counselor spoke. An Ashen, massive and slow-moving, its voice translated as something deep and resonant. Your species is young. 40 years of space travel is a fraction of what most member civilizations have navigated before seeking expanded status. Your confidence is noted. Thank you, Marcus said. Everyone looked at him. He smiled. That was a compliment, right? It was an observation, the Ashen said, after a beat. Sure, Marcus said agreeably. But here's the thing. 40 years is how long we've been out here. It doesn't account for what we learned before that, or how fast we learn when we need to. We've had to move quickly. Our situation didn't give us the option of taking a few centuries to ease into things. We had resource pressures, population distribution issues, a couple of near-miss extinction level events that required rapid technological development. He shrugged. We're not apologizing for still being alive. The Ashen regarded him with the particular stillness of a very old creature encountering something it hadn't categorized before. Morrison smoothly redirected. The Council has concerns about our trajectory. We understand that. We're not here to dismiss those concerns. What we're asking is that the conversation about those concerns happens between parties, not as a directive issued from one side to another. Humanity is willing to discuss coordination, communication frameworks, and mutual transparency agreements. We're not willing to accept retroactive restrictions on development we conducted in good faith before any such framework existed. Good faith, the Marin said. And the translator gave its voice something dry. You claim ignorance of Council governance as a defense. We claim an absence of agreement as a legal fact, Morrison said. There's a difference. He could feel the room recalibrating. This was the moment in every difficult negotiation, the point where the other side had prepared for capitulation and was encountering something else. They had several options available to them. They could escalate to threats. They could call a recess and regroup. They could dismiss the humans and issue a formal sanction, which they clearly had the power to do. Or they could do what Morrison was quietly, patiently steering toward. They could start actually talking. The Vreth conferred with two adjacent counselors in a rapid exchange that the translator did not render, which meant it was either too fast or deliberately excluded. Shun noted the exclusion. Marcus noted which counselors leaned in and which leaned out. Morrison waited, completely relaxed, giving nothing away. When the Vreth spoke again, its tone had shifted. Still formal, still authoritative, but fractionally less certain. The Council will consider a structured dialogue period, it said, contingent on a temporary freeze of further human expansion pending review. We can discuss parameters for a voluntary reporting mechanism during a dialogue period, Morrison said. A freeze isn't something we're in a position to agree to unilaterally. Our existing operations have schedules and supply chains. An abrupt halt causes harm to our people. That's not a bargaining position. It's a practical reality. You are asking the Council to negotiate with you as an equal party, the Marin said. And there was something in its translated voice that might have been disbelief. I'm asking the Council to negotiate with us as a party, Morrison said. The question of whether we're equal is exactly the kind of thing a good faith dialogue might eventually help establish. The session was not concluded that day. It was not designed to be. The Council called a formal recess, and the three humans were escorted back toward the diplomatic quarter through corridors that now felt slightly different. The same station, the same size, the same towering architecture. But something in the way the Ethon escort moved had changed. They were walking faster, not hurrying the humans, thinking. The recess lasted longer than one rotation. It lasted 3, and during those 3 days, the diplomatic quarter of Nexus Station became a quietly fascinating place. Word spread the way word always spreads on stations, through aides whispering to other aides, through glances exchanged in shared corridors, through the small behavioral shifts of species who had been observing. The Council chamber session from the upper tiers, and were now adjusting their assessments. The humans had not folded. That single fact was moving through the station like a slow current. Morrison knew it was happening. He had spent enough time in rooms full of competing interests to understand how information traveled when nobody was officially announcing anything. He used the 3 days methodically. He requested access to the Council's publicly available governance archives and spent long hours reading through centuries of precedent, not because he expected to find a loophole, but because understanding how the Council thought was more valuable than any argument he could construct without that understanding. What he found was interesting. The Council had not actually formally sanctioned a species in over 300 years. The last formal sanction had been issued against the Keth, a species that had attempted to jump development stages by acquiring weapons technology through theft rather than development. The Keth had been restricted to their home system for a century. They were now a minor council member with limited voting rights and a great deal of institutional resentment. The Council held it over them the way some institutions hold old punishments, not as active threat, but as precedent. As atmosphere got, Morrison noted this carefully. An institution that hadn't used its primary enforcement mechanism in 3 centuries was either very confident that the threat alone was sufficient, or quietly uncertain about whether the mechanism still worked. He suspected both. Chen spent the recess differently. She walked. She had requested permission to access the station's observation promenades, the public-facing sections where diplomatic delegations were permitted to move freely, and she walked them in long, measured circuits, early in the station's morning cycle when the corridors were less crowded. She wasn't looking for exits anymore. She had already mapped those in the first day. Now she was watching the other delegations. There were 43 species, currently represented on Nexus Station, not counting the 17 council members. Most of them were here in some form of ongoing diplomatic capacity, disputes being mediated, treaties being renewed, resource agreements being renegotiated. Some were here because they'd also received summonses, though none on the scale of humanities, and none, as far as Chen could determine, that had involved 3 representatives simultaneously. She noticed that several delegations watched her when they thought she wasn't looking. Not with hostility, with something more complicated, the expression of people who are trying to recategorize something they had previously filed incorrectly. On the second day, a small delegation from the Theorists, an avian species, light-boned and quick-moving, with iridescent plumage that shifted color as expressively as human facial expressions, made a point of crossing her path in one of the wider corridors. There, lead delegate inclined its head in a gesture that their translator rendered as polite acknowledgement between parties of equivalent standing. Chun returned the gesture. She kept walking, but she remembered it, and that evening she mentioned it to Morrison without emphasis. The way she mentioned things she had filed as potentially relevant. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Theorists have had a standing territorial dispute with the Marin for 60 years. The Council has been mediating it without resolution." Chun waited. One of the Council members who spoke most aggressively in session yesterday was Marin, Morrison said. He didn't say anything else, but Chun understood the shape of what he was. Thinking. Marcus came back late on the second day with what he called miscellaneous information, and Morrison called invaluable intelligence gathered through the entirely underestimated method of being friendly to strangers. He had spent time in the station's communal areas, the neutral spaces where junior delegates and aides from different species mingled, which senior diplomats often ignored because they seemed informal and therefore unimportant. He had learned, through a combination of universal translation, patient conversation, and one highly competitive game of something that worked like chess, but with pieces that could refuse orders, that the Council's current session calendar was under unusual strain. 3 separate major species negotiations had stalled simultaneously. 2 Council members were in a quiet political conflict over a development rights ruling from 8 years ago, and there was a growing informal discussion among the smaller species represented on the station about whether the Council's development parameters were genuinely equitable, or whether they primarily served the interests of the species who had been spacefaring longest and had the most to gain from keeping newer civilizations. Limited. Morrison listened to all of this without visible reaction. Then he sat for a long time looking at his notes. "They called us here because they're worried about us," he said finally. "But the worry isn't really about our fleet or our expansion rate. What is it about?" Marcus asked. "It's about what we represent. We expanded fast. We didn't follow the standard trajectory. We didn't come in asking for guidance or seeking membership because we needed protection. We came in because we were already out here." He paused. "That's threatening to a system built on the assumption that new species need the Council more than the Council needs them. So what do we do with that?" Chun asked. "We make it clear that what we represent isn't a threat to order," Morrison said. "It's an alternative data point. The Council's model assumed a certain pace and shape of development. We're evidence that the model has gaps. We're not trying to break the system. We're trying to show that the system needs updating." He looked at both of them. "If we can make that case without making them feel attacked, we might actually come out of this with something better than no sanctions." "What's better than no sanctions?" Marcus asked. "A seat at the table," Morrison said. The 4th-day session opened with a different energy. The chamber was the same. The black floors, the high dark ceiling, the elevated arc of council seats, but 3 of the 17 counselors had brought additional aides, which suggested preparation rather than simply authority. The Vreth opened the session with slightly less of the formal weight of the first day. A small thing, but Morrison noted it. He opened differently, too. The Council's concerns about predictability are legitimate, he said, without preamble. A civilization expanding faster than your models anticipated creates planning uncertainty. We understand that. What we'd like to offer is a transparency mechanism, not a freeze, not a restriction, but a process through which humanity provides advance, notification of major expansion decisions, and the Council has a formal channel to raise concerns before, rather than after, the fact. The Vreth's eyes shifted. A notification mechanism without binding constraint is not a governance framework. It's a beginning of one, Morrison said. You've been governing civilizations for 4,000 years. We've been in space for 40. A framework built for a 40-year civilization that tries to bind it the way you'd bind a 4,000-year. One either breaks the civilization or breaks the framework. Neither outcome benefits anyone. A long silence. You're arguing for a tiered framework, the Ashen said. Slowly. I'm arguing for a realistic one, Morrison said. The Marin Councilor's internal structures were moving quickly again. And in exchange for this notification mechanism, humanity agrees to what, precisely? Formal first contact coordination going forward, Morrison said. We agree that uncoordinated first contact with new species creates instability, not because the Council told us to agree, but because we've seen the downstream problems ourselves. We'll work within a coordination framework for future contacts. He let that land. We're also prepared to share navigational data from our exploration of the Reach territories. Your charts of that region are outdated. Ours aren't. That offer did something specific to the chamber. Morrison had calculated it carefully. The Reach territories were poorly mapped and known to contain unexplored resources. Every species in the room had an interest in that data. It wasn't a concession that cost humanity strategically. They had already been through the Reach, but it was something concrete and genuinely valuable. Offered freely. The dynamic shifted in a way that was almost audible. Chen watched the Council members lean forward, almost imperceptibly. She watched the Marin structure slow. She watched the Theris representative in the upper observer tier make a small gesture to a colleague that she had learned. In 3 days of watching alien body language, meant something close to pay attention. Marcus watched the Vreth's eyes cycle through colors, and noted that it settled on a shade the briefing documents hadn't listed, which meant they were in territory the briefing documents hadn't mapped. The Council will require time to evaluate these proposals, the Vreth said. Of course, Morrison said. We're not in a hurry, which was true, and also the most quietly remarkable thing said in that chamber in recent memory, because every other species that stood in that spot had always been in a hurry. The Council's evaluation took 4 more days. Morrison expected 3. Chen expected 5. Marcus had not made a prediction, but spent the intervening time learning a 6th card game from a Theris aide, who was increasingly comfortable sitting in the communal spaces and talking to him, which told Morrison everything he needed to know about the informal temperature of the station. On the morning of the 4th day, the summons came again. The chamber was arranged differently. The detail was small enough that a less careful observer might have missed it. The speaking position in the center of the floor had been modified, almost imperceptibly. The inlaid bioluminescent lines had been reconfigured so that the center point was no longer the lowest position relative to the Council arc. It was level. Not dramatically, not as a declared gesture, but enough that anyone who had stood there before and was paying attention would feel the difference. Morrison felt it immediately. He filed it without comment. The Vreth spoke with the same flat precision as before, but the formal weight, the sense of an institution issuing a ruling, was fractionally reduced. What replaced it was something closer to the tone of a very senior party at a table, with a party it was deciding to treat as less junior. The Council has reviewed humanity's proposals, it said. A notification and coordination framework is acceptable in principle, subject to specific operational terms to be negotiated. The navigational data exchange is also acceptable, with reciprocal data sharing from Council mapping archives of adjacent territories. Morrison kept his expression neutral. Internally, the reciprocal data offer landed like a gift, not something he had asked for, but something the Council was offering, because the alternative was receiving a benefit without giving one. And an institution 4,000 years old understood what that implied about power balance. The Council also notes, the Vreth continued, that humanity's unilateral development, while proceeding outside established frameworks, has not resulted in the destabilizing. Incidents are parameters predicted for a civilization at your development stage. There was a pause that Morrison recognized as the kind that preceded a significant admission. Your casualty rates in colonial conflicts are lower than models projected. Your resource extraction operations have not produced the environmental collapse, events that typically accompany rapid early-stage expansion. Your first contact incidents, while uncoordinated, did not result in hostile engagements. The Vreth's eyes cycled. The Council acknowledges that the current parameters were not designed with your developmental profile in mind. We appreciate that acknowledgement, Morrison said. It is not an apology, the Marin said. Crisply, I didn't take it as one, Morrison said. I took it as an accurate statement. Chen watched the Marin's internal structures. They were slower than they had been in the first session. Not calm, processing. There was a difference. The Ashen spoke next, slower than the others, with the particular deliberateness of something very old choosing its words. There is the matter of humanity's standing. You have proposed frameworks that imply a cooperative relationship with the Council rather than a governed one. The Council does not extend cooperative status lightly. We're not asking for it lightly, Morrison said. We're noting that the practical reality of our situation, our fleet capacity, our territory, our independent contact history, means that a purely governed relationship doesn't reflect what actually exists. Pretending otherwise might be satisfying procedurally, but it won't work practically. You are describing de facto status, a fifth counselor said. This one hadn't spoken before. A Selvari, covered in deep blue resonant membranes that vibrated when it communicated, giving its translated voice an odd harmonic quality. You are saying that your behavior and your presence have created a fact that the Council must account for, regardless of formal category. Yes, Morrison said. That is an unusual argument for a species to make about itself, the Selvari said. Most species don't recognize it until someone else points it out. Marcus said, from his position at Morrison's right. We just figured we'd save everyone the step. The Selvari's membranes vibrated in a pattern the translator described as evaluative humor response. It was the first anything resembling humor had appeared in 2 sessions of Council proceedings. The Vreth, who did not appear to process humor, moved the session forward. The Council is prepared to offer provisional associate standing to humanity, effective upon agreement to the coordination and notification framework, with full review after 20 planetary years. Associate standing provides consultation rights on Council rulings that directly affect human territory, participation in the data-sharing networks, and access to Council mediation services. Morrison let the silence sit for exactly the right amount of time. Not long enough to seem hesitant. Long enough to seem like someone who was thinking rather than celebrating. That's a reasonable framework to begin a conversation, he said. We'll need to work through the operational terms of the notification framework, specifically around timeline requirements. Some of our expansion decisions are operationally time-sensitive and a lengthy consultation. window before every decision isn't practical. We'd want to differentiate between major territorial expansion, which can accommodate advance notice, and operational decisions in active systems, which can't. That differentiation will need to be defined precisely, Evreth said. Agreed, Morrison said. That's exactly the kind of thing a working group is for. And there it was, the word working group, which in the language of diplomacy meant that the confrontation was over and the negotiation had begun. The council had come into this session with the architecture of a ruling. They were leaving with the architecture of a process. That was not a loss for them, but it was different from what they had intended, and everyone in the room understood the difference. The next 2 days were operational. A small team of council administrative staff, Ethan mostly, efficient and precise, worked with Morrison through the specific language of the coordination framework. Chen participated in the sessions about territorial definitions, which required understanding of fleet logistics and defensive posture that Morrison deferred to her on entirely. Marcus sat in on the data-sharing discussions and twice caught the Council's archivists attempting to frame the exchange terms in ways that would have given humanity access to significantly less than was implied by the headline agreement. He pointed this out both times with cheerful specificity that left the archivists recalibrating their assessment of what they were dealing with. On the final day, Morrison, Chen, and Marcus stood in the chamber one more time. The document of provisional associate standing had been prepared, a physical document, in the Council's tradition, rendered on material older than most human institutions, in 17 languages, and the standard diplomatic script. The signing was not ceremonial in the way human signings often were. No speeches, no fanfare. The Vreth presented the document. Morrison reviewed it one final time. He made 2 small corrections to phrasing that would have been invisible to anyone not reading carefully, but which shifted the interpretation of 2 clauses in ways that would matter in 20 years when the review period arrived. The Council's aides reviewed the corrections, conferred quietly, and accepted both. Morrison signed. Chen countersigned as witness. Marcus signed on the line designated for secondary representative. When it was done, the Ethon delegate who had met them at the docking bay on the first day, the same one whose eyes had gone to darker colors, when they hadn't been afraid, stepped forward to collect the document. It paused. Its eyes cycled through several shades, settling finally on one the briefing documents described as reassessment. Your species was not what the Council prepared for, it said, with what sounded like the careful honesty of something that had spent a great deal of time thinking about how to say this. We rarely are, Morrison said, with equal honesty. The walk back to their shuttle was quiet for a while. The station felt the same, enormous, ancient, built to make civilizations understand their place in a very old order. It had not changed, but something about the way it felt to walk through it had. Chen spoke first. Associate standing. That's more than we came in expecting. I came in expecting to not get sanctioned, Marcus said. The working group on the notification framework is going to be difficult, Morrison said. The Council is going to try to use the definition process to narrow our operational flexibility. We'll need good people on it. That's a problem for when we're home, Chen said. Yes. Morrison agreed. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the silence of people who had done something difficult and done it well, and were still processing the shape of what had changed. At the docking bay, their shuttle waited among the alien ships of 17 designs, and beyond the bay, through the vast exterior viewports. The stars were the same stars they had always been. Humanity had walked into the oldest room in the galaxy, been told its place, and responded by demonstrating that its place was not what anyone had assumed, not through force, not through threat, through 3 people who simply refused to be smaller than they were, asked good questions, listened carefully, offered something real and held steady when the room expected them to bend.